As I said, today's conversation is the final one in a 4-part series, and we'll consider where we go from here. Together, we've heard about the expert mechanism on the rights of Indigenous peoples, EMRIP, and how it provides the United Nations Human Rights Council with expertise and advice on the rights of Indigenous peoples. As our conversation series was inspired by the University of British Columbia's convening just before COVID changed our world to look at the repatriation of ancestors, belongings, and treasures of Indigenous peoples currently in the hands of state institutions like museums and universities. This expert seminar supported EMRIP's work, drafting a report on these issues, which was presented and adopted in October 2020. So with our conversation, we're looking at what comes next. So let's take a moment and meet the speakers who accepted our invitation today. We're very grateful to have them with us. Brandy McDonald, who's with the Museum of Us in San Diego, California in the US. Riki Mamaku with Te Papa, the Museum of New Zealand. Jojobungu, International Standing Committee on the Traffic of Illicit Antiquities, and Jojobungu Heritage Consultants in Kenya. And joining us, we hope intermittently at the very best, but definitely through recording, will be Deidre Solani, who's an independent expert on intangible heritage in South Africa. Unfortunately for Deidre, she's battling irregular connectivity. So we are prepared, whether she jumps in and joins us at some point or we use her recordings, we'll be able to hear her voice today. And I am grateful for her determination to be with us. So as we start, I would like for us to introduce ourselves a little bit. Tell your story about where you're working, the kind of work you're doing, how you've come to this work, and how you're thinking about repatriation at this time. So let's start with George.
Thank you very much, Cinnamon. That's a big surprise. I thought we were someone else so I could actually follow them. But yes, my name is Jojobungu. I'm a Kenyan. I'm an archaeologist by training and worked with the National Museums of Kenya for many years and left and went into heritage management and planning. So I do a lot of consultancy works and deal with basically all the conventions of UNESCO. From the Hague Convention of 1954, all the way 1970, 1972, 2001, 2003, and 2005. All those cultural conventions have dealt with issues of intangible heritage. Now, I've also been a member of ICOM for many years. I was a vice president of ICOM for 6 years and a member of the executive board for 6 years, so 12 years in the board. During that time, I developed very close interest in the issue of repatriation, and coming from a country that has also suffered colonialism and also loss of heritage during the colonial time and after, I have been very much keen on that. I've been engaged very much on the discussion on issues of the evolving roles of museums, particularly the so-called Universal Museum. I think I was probably one of the first people to be engaged on that discussion because I felt it was part of a way of avoiding discussing some of these very crucial and painful past. So I've been involved in different ways. I've also been involved as Director General of the National Museums in the issue of repatriation of some of the materials, for example, the Vigango, which are the Mijikenda carved figures that represent elders. And that has been quite successful from the US particularly. And it's an ongoing discussion. And I think it can be quoted as one of the best examples of return, but it did not come easily. It came through very difficult negotiations, very difficult arguments, very painful memories. And it has shown that these objects and these ancestral remains are absolutely crucial to the lives of the communities where they come from. And in their absence, and in the absence of a proper solution to this particular problem, they remain completely, haunted by these problems, and they continue to suffer. And it is something that makes this subject of crucial importance for all of us as humanity to be able to discuss it once and for all and come up with a solution that will, be favorable to everybody. And so that at the end of the day, we may let the spirits to rest. Thank you.
Next, let's have Te Riki.
Ko pūtaua ki te maunga, ko rangitai ki te awa, ko ngā si awa te iwi, ko mā tātua te waka, ko te ariki rangi mamaku tōku ingoa, he kaimahi au no te papatonga rewa tēnei ka mihi atu kia koutou i tēnei pō, i tēnei rā. O tira me tuku i ngā mihi ki rātou te hunga mate, ki a rātou te hunga e oki tinana mai rā i ngā taketake i ngā maunga, i ngā pāpāringo i a awo i a moana i runga hoki o tātou marae maa putono i te motu, moi mai rā. My name is Te Riki Rangi Mamaku, and I'm the Repatriation Program Coordinator for Karanga Aotearoa, New Zealand's government-mandated repatriation program. I first started my introduction by acknowledging my ancestral mountain, Pūtauaki, the ancestral waters from my homeland, the River Rangitaiki, and my ancestral canoe. But also extending a greeting to everyone that's participating today and also viewing. But more importantly, it was really important to acknowledge the ancestors and those who we are living memories and living reflections of, because at the heart of our work, it is about those who came before us and exercising our duty to honor them. That's a very important part of my introduction. I'm actually dialing in from the uncontested lands of the Scandinavians up in Copenhagen, in Denmark, and so it would be remiss of me to not acknowledge the land from which I'm broadcasting from, because it is our practice and it is what we do. So I acknowledge all the centuries of Scandinavians and Vikings from these lands. So I've been working for Te Papa in the repatriation program as its coordinator since 2009, so for 12 years. And our approach towards repatriation is something I don't think it's inherently unique, but it's something that's very, very beneficial for our work and how we actually conduct our work. And what underpins our program and our principles is really set at the top from the legislation from the Treaty of Waitangi that was signed in 1840 between the Māori tribes and also the British colonial government that then established what we now know as Aotearoa New Zealand. Why I actually mention that is because it is in the spirit of partnership, which is based on the principles of this treaty, that has established our program and indeed our institution as a bicultural institution. So it's an institution that recognizes the value and the importance of the tangata whenua, of the people of the land, and also tangata tiriti. So the waves of generations of people that have come post 1840. And so in the spirit of partnership, it is incumbent on us to actually move forward and conduct ourselves in such a way. Fortunately for us, we have been doing this for quite a long time. Our program was set up in 2002, being mandated by the government, but that's just this current iteration of our repatriation work and how it's actually manifested. Of course, before 2002, there were still repatriations and negotiations and discussions for ancestral remains that laid in foreign collections. And so where we are now with our current iteration is a legacy that was started by by our grandparents and by our ancestors. And so so we acknowledge that, and by and large it is with this ethos, I guess, that that has created the successful nature for our discussions. And like, well, not to say that they haven't been challenging, because like some of these claims do tend to extend over periods of like maybe 10 years or maybe 20 years, or sometimes even quicker than that. But what we do know is that our practice grows as we move forward. So I'm really interested to see, and and I have observed just the shifts and changes in the attitudes among international institutions towards repatriation, to actually engaging in a dialogue and having a discussion around repatriation, whereas a few short decades ago was just a flat out no, or everything will be done by institutions to draw out a process. So it was never a situation of a yes, just a no being a yes just waiting to happen. It was just a no was just a no. So I guess we are really, really grateful for the climate that we're in. But of course there are challenges that we face, and I think that the global pandemic has created an opportunity for everyone all over the world, being locked away in their apartments and in their homes with their families, to sit back and to reflect and to actually find creative and more meaningful ways to collaborate and to work together. So I also want to acknowledge the global series of conversations that I'm honored to be a part of. So thank you, Cinnamon.
While Lorna is queuing up the greeting from Deidre, let's hear from Brandy about your work.
Halito Chokma Sanofa Brandy McDonald Chakasasea Chatasea. Hi, I'm Brandy McDonald. My pronouns are she, her. I am a citizen of the Chickasaw Nation with ancestral ties to the Choctaw Nation. I am currently in the unceded ancestral territory and homelands of the Kumeyaay Nation in San Diego, California, USA. And I work at the Museum of Us. I'm the director of decolonizing initiatives at the museum. I've been working with the museum for about 4 years, and I'm part of the Decolonizing Initiatives Department, which is one of the, it's part of the institutional fabric is the Decolonizing Initiatives Department, just as the same as your development department is, or your education department, or your cultural resources department, which I think is so exciting, because when I started in the field, a department and a position like this didn't exist, which is just really seeing, which I think that many of the panelists just spoke about, is the growth of the field, which continues to give me hope, and recognizing there's still a lot that needs to grow, and we're moving, right? These pillars, these mountains of colonization that have been birthed from the colonial endeavor are changing. It's slow, but we're changing, which is so exciting, that hopefully the next generation won't have to deal with the same challenges that we do. And so I think about the work that I do. I'm also a PhD student at the University of California, San Diego, in the Education Studies Department. I just finished my second year, which is so exciting. So I'm moving into my qualifying exams. Thank you. Lots of naps, loss of sleep, but lots of naps, which is wonderful. So my research also focuses on decolonization within museums and formal learning spaces, but really thinking about, what does decolonization look like? What are decolonial practices? What are anti-colonial practices? And how do they manifest in space? So really thinking about the work we're doing at the Museum of Us, but also what are the physical manifestations in different places, and the work that our amazing, brilliant panelists are talking about, and other folks before us have talked about. And so the work that I do at the museum collectively with the team and the board and the leaderships, it's really a collective endeavor. It can't just be me bashing the wall. Like, there's folks, like, we have to work together to make this happen. And so we're looking at it as a systemic change, that it's not just that wonderful thing that happens in cultural resources, or that cute thing that happens in education, right? Or the thing that visitor experience talks about. It is everywhere. It's in the governance, it's within our language, it's within our practices, our human resources, all throughout. And so we're really looking at it through approaching it as it needs to shift within policies and practice in order for it to create systemic, sustainable change. And so really trying to figure out the ways that colonization has deeply embedded its claws within the institution. The building was built in 1915, and has always been a an anthropology museum. The facade is a monument to the colonizers with 9 colonizers etched into its skin. And so what does that look like for even Indigenous people like myself working there and other folks coming into this space? And we talk about decolonial work. What does it mean when our exoskeleton matches the colonial rot that's inside? And so it's really thinking about these policies and practices and switching and starting to work towards changing that ethos of our work. And that's through curatorial work, stewardship, and the policies, which we'll talk a little bit about. I don't want to hold up too much space. I'm so grateful to be here. Thank you all for attending. I think we have quite a bit of folks in this space, and I just really appreciate wherever you are in the world, the time that you're giving. It's a gift to sit in this space with you, and then also to be able to sit in this conversation. On mute. You're on mute.
Lorna, can you cue up the welcome from Deidre?
My name is Deidre Prince Solani. I am based in Cape Town, South Africa. I'm a specialist in education, culture and heritage and a facilitator of strategic planning and policy design. My experience over the past 3 decades have been in the areas of tangible and intangible cultural heritage, and identify myself as a poet, memory maker, storyteller and archive. I am currently registered as a student at the African Centre for Cities at the University of Cape Town, exploring the ways in which living heritage, memory, and interior worlds can inform transformative and inclusive urban planning. My focus on spatial justice has largely included efforts to train communities around community-based inventorying and to support the creation of specifications for the inclusion of living heritage into spatial development plans. My experience of working within museums spans many years. I started working in museums formally at the Robben Island Museum and World Heritage Site in 1998, and becoming the Director of Education and Public Programming for 11 years, where the programs, at the core of all of these programs, rested social justice and restorative justice. My work across the African continent included serving as the director for the Center for Heritage Development in Africa, and it focused very much on world heritage and natural and cultural heritage sites across the continent in the development of conservation management plans, interpretation and beneficiation strategies. The work also extended and expanded as my training in the facilitator role through the UNESCO 2003 Convention on Living Heritage. Subsequent to my return to South Africa, I was involved in working at the Museum of AIDS in Africa, addressing questions of healing of memories through objects, and in that engagement encountered many of the questions related to repatriation, absence, silence, and marginalization. I now serve as advisor to the World Art and Memory Museum. Among some of the publications I've been involved in has related very much to culture, heritage, memory making, and narrative design, with a forthcoming chapter in a book soon to be published by the South African Human Science Research Council, and the chapter's titled Narrative Design and Memory Making as Healing Modality. I am very excited to be a part of this conversation and to meet this incredible community of activists.
So I'm sure you feel like I do, that you so wish she was here with us, but I do appreciate her message, and I know we can build from that as well. So as I said earlier, this is the 4th in a series of an important conversation about the return of cultural heritage, globally speaking. And what I hope to do is, in a way, summarize what we've talked about, but build our conversation and think about what we do moving forward. In our first session in the series, we heard more details about the convening of experts in British Columbia last year. And in many ways, the San Diego Museum of Us has thought through the importance of returning cultural heritage, just as Brandy described. So I want to start with Brandy in her role, because I know that repatriation figures prominently in your portfolio. Can you share with us how the museum is approaching the necessary global conversation it needs to have. How are your repatriation efforts progressing? And what commitments and policies have you put in place to make sure it keeps going?
Thank you. Yeah. So repatriation is at the heart of decolonial work. And I think that our team really believes that. Our board believes in it. And the folks who have worked before us and the folks that are presently working, this is a part of our work. This is a part of the heartbeat of the organization and is the future of the organization. We are actively repatriating under the federal piece of legislation, NAGPRA, the Native American Graves Protection and Repatriation Act. And we are also working towards actively repatriating through our colonial pathways policy. And so this policy, I love policy. I also love policy if there's practice and action behind policy, where policy doesn't just live on the shared drive and it's fancy words that you click up every so often, but it's policy that is embedded within the institutional fabric and the work, and it's part of the culture, right? And so that's when practice comes in, and the culture and the shifting and making it systemic. And that's what we're working with the colonial pathways policy. It was a collective policy that we pulled together, where it wasn't just something that my predecessor wrote or the deputy director wrote, but it was something that we all collectively sat down at the table. Board members, staff members, and community members came and wrote and moved forward together, and then moved into the board meeting to get it passed. And so what this policy says is that everything within our cultural resource holding, all 75,000 ethnographic items from around the world, all of the ancestors that we have within our cultural holdings that we're stewarding at this moment, that it doesn't matter where they come from, or it doesn't matter where and the time period, or what matters is the fact that how they came to us. If they came to us through a colonial pathways, or if holding on to these cultural resources and ancestors is a reflection of colonization because we're taking ownership and the community wants them back, then they need to go home. And so repatriation is at the heart of it. If the community decides that they don't want the cultural resources or ancestors back, what does it look like to make sure that we are stewarding these cultural resources and ancestors in the way that the community wants them to be stewarded? And so making sure that we're holding space to recognize that Indigenous peoples are the experts about their belongings, their cultural practices, and the knowledge. So we're privileging Indigenous voices, privileging their practices and their wants and needs, and recognizing that wants and needs change. And so if community members come to us today and say, we actually don't want this back, but maybe we want part of this back, that's great. They come back to us 2 months from now and say, it's actually shifted. The elders, we've decided that we actually want this back as well. And we want our story to be told this way. That's also okay, because wants and needs change, culture changes, the impacts of colonization change. And so we really want to make sure our policy and our practices are fluid, because decolonial practices are fluid. They need to be fluid because change happens, right? And colonization manipulates in order to continue to maintain power. And so that's where we see within this policy and within our repatriation practice is really working with the community to find out what the community wants.
Thank you. Well, I'm forever inspired by the work you're doing, so keep it up. I know we all learn from it. And we learned in our second conversation, Indigenous-led initiatives, how important policies as you described and guidelines are for institutions. Formal structures like this help us ensure that processes are followed. But despite this, human action affects how successful we are in repatriation. It may be leadership that's less interested in this work. It may be anthropologists acting as gatekeepers, preventing a smooth return. It could be all kinds of things. The list of possibilities is endless. But I know, and I think many of us agree, that Indigenous leadership is key, but isn't always positioned well. So I want to turn to Riki, working within and across institutions and communities. How critical is Indigenous leadership, and how do we ensure it is prioritized? Can you give us an example of where Indigenous leadership was essential to the success of an exchange, a project, a program, or something like that I've described? Tell us what it looks like, feels like, when Indigenous leadership is where it needs to be.
Kia ora, Sinu, and I think fantastic question. But I think I want to approach it from an angle where it's actually not just Indigenous leadership, but it's also Indigenous communities as well, and therefore it actually it shifts the burden of responsibility. Well, it doesn't shift it, but it distributes the burden of responsibility towards the collective rather than the few. Of course, I think that there's definitely space for Indigenous leaders to guide and to direct the work, but it takes it takes a tribe. It takes a tribe to actually deliver on the promises that we make, and that also takes a tribe to be in a position to champion for Indigenous voices and Indigenous participation in the development of policies and the delivery of these programs, but also it's also incumbent on us to actually demonstrate through the success of our work, through the long-term sustainability of other relationships that we establish, the real value around involving Indigenous communities and Indigenous leadership. As an example, and just swinging back to my reference to Te Papa being a bicultural organization, the Karanga Aotearoa Repatriation Program is designed in such a way where we have an administrative and a facilitating body part of our program, which actually consists of the head of repatriation, Te Kiki Herewini, myself as the coordinator, and our various researchers, Dr. Emma Aranui, and Dr. Susan Thorpe. So like we have a really small team, and quite often we do become at the coalface of the work, but we are not the totality of the work, because along with our program and along with our very small team, we're actually guided and directed by a repatriation advisory panel. And the function of the repatriation the consistency of the advisory panel is elders. It's Māori elders, Māori elders, community representatives, academics, artists, and practitioners. And so therefore you have a diversity of Indigenous leadership and Indigenous community voices helping to direct our program. And that's something that I also want to encourage and also promote for people to actually be invested in that whole. It can be difficult. It can be, it can be really difficult to try and negotiate and to facilitate a way forward when you have so many diverse voices. But that's where the magic actually happens, and you actually create solutions that you never really intended to. So just an example with our work, whenever we are kind of like going through the negotiation stage with museums and cultural institutions and private collections, there's always a space for dialogue. And wherever possible, we always try to make sure that wherever we go, we take our elders with us. We take our elders with us to help us tell our story of the importance of these ancestors and what they actually mean, not just to a few Māori, but to us Māori as a collective, as a nation, as a people with values. We have an enduring connection with our dead, which also pays off because it's really hard to say no to old people. But that's part of the beauty of the whole thing, and this is why we actually are invested in the type of work, in the work that we do. It humanizes it, but also the exciting thing about working in a repatriation for me is around the part that I'm playing in restoring human dignity. And that's that's something that's really important, especially when we're talking about Indigenous human rights. It is about just looking at the fundamentals and the principles that actually everybody has in common, no matter which country you actually come from, and it's around that human dignity. So, as an example, we have a Indigenous repatriation advisory panel to guide us, but we also include them as well, and also community representatives and tribal representatives if there are particular iwi. So in 2019, we had a repatriation of about 112 ancestral remains from the Berlin Medical History Museum, the Shai Te institution, and part of that process, when we actually went to the institution to uplift these ancestors, there was a large portion of them that actually came from the Chatham Islands, they were Moriori. And so we took Moriori with us. to go and to pick up their ancestors, to weep over their ancestors, and to accompany and to carry them home, and to be and that's around participation, and that's how participation is expressed for us. So yeah, just to answer your question again, that is around being champions for Indigenous communities and Indigenous-led programs, but also just working tooth and nail to promote the value, not just for ourselves, but also for the institutions as well. Thank you.
Oh, thank you for that. I really appreciate the way you reframed that, because you get a sense of the dynamic and the complexity, but also the transformational experience that it is when you work with community. It was really powerful. So I'm going to turn to George. During our last session, Museum Dialogues, it was titled, we heard powerful examples of intercontinental collaboration and communication around the return of Yaqui ceremonial deerhead, the highest spiritual and cultural significance, and the return of Agongo to the Mijikanda communities. George, despite these examples, we still hear museum professionals indicate that they're willing to return ancestors and cultural heritage, then follow up and say, but who do we return them to? And I know we've talked about this before, but museums continue to use this as an excuse. What role can museums have as facilitators or intermediaries in international repatriation to ensure ancestors and objects go to the proper communities? What is our duty? How do we begin if we don't know where to start?
Thank you very much, Cinnamon, for that very important question. I think that question really lies at the core of the discussion of repatriation. But I think that before we go into that, maybe we need to look at a number of issues here. How people in the museum still deal with what they have. For them, they are collections. They're just collections. Even when they're dealing with ancestral, remains. And I think that this has been raised here. The question of humanization. How do we treat them? How do we change the mindset? Because you have to decolonize the museum first before it can be active on that. Now, let me first say, because my experience or my area where I have dealt a lot with this issue is in Africa, that nobody is really asking museums in the West and in America too, that they should actually empty their storage. So I think there is this fear that the word restitution means opening up to question of reparation and opening up to question of, basically, opening up the storage to be emptied. The second thing that I think we need to look at is that what is being asked in most cases, the requests that are made, are of great spiritual, symbolic significance, or sometimes are ancestors, human remains. Now, the fact also is that most of these that we find in museums have a history. Because why have them in the museum if they have no history? The excuse has always been, we need to look at provenance, we need to do that. But they are exhibiting some, they are having this collection, the storage, which means they value them. So they must have a history. You can't value something that you don't have at least some information about. So how can you turn around and say we don't know who to take them to, when you already have that history in the archives? So we need to actually change that mindset. We need to be able to work very, very differently, from curatorial to management to all those areas. Now, the issue of humanizing, particularly the ancestors, is very important. I think that we still tend to, even when we are in the process of repatriation, you find that human remains are kept in little boxes and passed over on those little boxes without, that they are just passing them over. I think that we need to, first of all, make sure that those people in the museum start thinking differently. They must start thinking like those people who have suffered. They must start thinking like those people whose ancestors are in those particular places where they should not be. They must change their mindset. There must be a total paradigm shift within the museum itself. Otherwise, the language will always be the same, because the people you are talking to are looking at these ancestors not as ancestors, but as collections. At what time do they humanize these collections to make them become humans so that they can respect them the way they respect their own grandparents or their great-grandparents? I think that is where the core of the matter is. And more so, we know that most of these, what they call collections, were taken illegally. They were taken under duress, under plunder, war, as war booties, sometimes even through genocide. Look at places in Africa. Look at places like Namibia. Look at Tanzania with the Maji Maji. Look at the Herero and Nama. How can you turn around and say, no, we are going to keep these bodies because we have kept them here for scientific reasons, or we don't have the Namas and the Hereros who can be able to inherit this particular? It's impossible. So it doesn't make sense, because people have not changed their mind. They still treat those particular human beings or collections of importance, spiritual importance, as collections. The other thing that I want to say is that it is not the one that is illegally holding, whether it is an object or a human remain, who should have the final decision of where an ancestor or should be taken. You don't take my thing, or your great-grandfather, grandmother picked something, you came to know about it, that it was illegally taken, or under duress, people died, you are holding it. And when I come to you, you tell me, yes, I know about this history. I know about all this, but you do not have enough good facilities to keep this, whatever we took from you. You are not capable of doing that. How can someone who has taken your thing illegally tell you how to be able to deal with that? So these are questions that we need to deal with in the museum. And this is part of the decolonization, because if we do not decolonize the mind of the museum and the mind of the museum professionals, we will be talking about this for years to come. So I think these are issues that we have to tackle head on. And for me, the museums should not be acting really, because already museums have been in very bad books. I mean, everybody believed in museums in the past. They were sort of, these innocent places that were non-political and all that. But in reality, if you look at the history of museums, you can also study the history of genocide. You can study the history of plunder. You can study the history of theft. You can study, and we have given our lives for the museum, but we need to self-critique. We need to find out, we need to accept that there have been some things that have gone very wrong. And instead of putting brakes as to where we should move by claiming either that the places that they're being taken are not ready enough, or that the people who are being taken have not asked for them, or that there are no people that they can take them to. Instead of putting those brakes, we as the museums, or museums as institutions, should be engaged in serious studies, in co-curation, in co-researching with the communities to find out where the ancestors came from, where the objects came from, and make sure that they return those, whatever has been asked for. I think it is very important. And this is not something that started recently. For Africa, for example, since the 1960s, the leaders were asking for the return of the material. And some of them were told, you either get your independence or you get your collections. So they say, okay, let's get this independence. And now they're asking, now those agendas that remained, we want to revisit them. We want them back. And someone tells you, but who do we give them to? But they are states, they are governments, they are people, they are communities. So I think museums need to self-reflect. They need to take their responsibility very seriously, both in the North and also in the South. And museums in the South should also not just be copies of the ones in the North. We also have to decolonize wherever we are, so that we don't have that same mentality of just keeping things forever. And to give you the last example that you probably are quite aware of, and you mentioned the Vigango. When the Vigangos were taken, the first time the Vigangos were taken from the US, from the University Museum of Illinois, when it reached the community, people were crying. These are carvings, but carvings that have people, you know, they believe that their ancestors are incarnated into these carvings. And the wife of one of those, she cried and said, we knew he had gone for a long journey, but we knew that one day he'll come back. When he was away, there was famine, there were diseases, children were sick. We had a lot of problems. Now that he's back, we know that things are going to be okay. That is how much it means. But are you telling me that the museum community, the curators and all those people understand that? Do they understand the language that the first and the only African Director General of UNESCO, Mokhtomba, said in 1978 when he was pleading for restitution of materials? And he actually said, men and women of these countries have a right to recover these cultural assets that are part of their being. I think museum needs to reflect, to go back to some of these very wise words, to be a little bit humanistic and not just operate in a technical way. For me, I think that probably would be the solution. So rather than being a hindrance, museums should actually be acting as a bridge to the communities, so that the communities can see them as partners rather than as competitors or institutions that keep on their heritage and their ancestors in perpetuity, and therefore keeping the spirits of their ancestors detained in places where they don't belong.
Thank you, George. I think what I'm hearing as we get ready to head into this last question I had prepared for Deidre, and while I'm saying this, Lorna will be queuing up that recording. What I'm hearing is what I hope we can finish talking about is this global framework, the future. And what I'm hearing, especially from what George just said and what's already been said, is that to move forward, we have to have structure. We have to be with community. And we have personal responsibility, right? So it's the individual, the group, and the place we move in, right? Whether that's policy or institution or whatever trappings there might be. It's complex, and all of those things have a different agenda, of course, a different motivating force, but they have to come together to make this change come about. That's what I'm hearing. So we'll return to that in a minute and see if that resonates at all, or if there's something else that we need to build into this future momentum and this framework we're working toward. So with that, I'm going to read the question that I gave to Deidre, which does contribute to what I just said. I've observed through this series the importance of relationships and how they relate to restorative justice, creating them, nurturing them, maintaining open communication. So in your experience, Deidre, how does this look in practice? What are the underlying principles and qualities for and of relationship building for restorative justice? Lorna?
I have been asked to address specifically a question related to relationships and relationship building. And in addressing these questions, I wish first to think carefully around the context into which I'm speaking. So the first context that I would like to refer to is the fact that I like to believe that we are doing the work of activism within the framework of deep time. Deep time in the sense of being inclusive, that it's not just the human world and humanity that this work is being done with and for, but the more than human world as well. And secondly, that the past and the future are all interconnected, and that the work that we are doing is long-term work which we may never ever see a result of or ultimately meet the vision that we've set out to achieve. The second context is that it is an iterative process, that as contexts change and evolve over time, so too is the call for the repatriation. And we have to be constantly aware of the changes that are taking place, both at a global, local, national, state level, and community levels. And so there is a sense, therefore, that we are constantly learning. There's a constant process of learning and analysis and a return and a moving forward. It is not and never could be a single issue struggle, this. This is a struggle that forms part of a much larger global struggle for restorative justice, which I will come to in a minute. The third context is that there is a global and local and everything in between about this struggle. So the first context is deep time. The second, that it is an iterative process. Third, that it operates at both a global and a local level. The second issue that I'd like to address in response, the first was context. The second is, what do I mean by restorative justice, and why do I call this process restorative justice? Well, firstly, because crimes have been committed, and I think that we need to be honest and we need to state that up front. The process of extraction, be it the extraction of knowledge, be it the extraction of objects or artifacts, be it the extraction of peoples from the land, these are crimes, and they are crimes against humanity. In the similar way, there is a crime that has been committed around the cultural identity and sense of belonging, which comes with the erasure of people's histories and stories, the marginalization of values that have informed societies over centuries, over decades. So restorative justice brings into focus the fact that a crime has been committed. The restorative nature of it, and therefore it's calling for justice. The restorative nature of this is that we are wishing for a restoration. We're wishing for something to be restored, be it the values that have been lost, or be it an affirmation of the values that have continued to be transmitted across generations. And that's a very important factor. So coming to the kinds of relationships then that one would want to nurture and nourish within the struggle is, one, relationships that are across sectors, the identification of allies who can support this struggle. And it requires us to think very carefully about relationships beyond the boundaries and the borders of the cultural sector. How can one engage beyond that? For example, in some of the spatial justice work which I do not work necessarily with cultural activists. I'm working with land activists, housing activists, and bringing in a conversation about culture in all of that. The second issue related to relationship is the creation and the the nurturing of communities of care, because this work is hard, it is long, and requires a sensibility that is not necessarily only flag waving. It's a sensibility that supports communities, creates communities of care where kindness and justice and healing remains at the center of the work, so that what is restored is not only a physical item or a sense of knowing or knowledge, but it's also a return to the values of the collective, and the communities of care in protecting and supporting activists doing work which often exposes them to harassment, to marginalization, to unemployment, and so on. A third aspect is that the work has to be about relationship building across and between generations. There is much that has been done by generations before around repatriation. How can one draw on the knowledge, the beliefs, the methodologies that have been used and reintroduce the best of those into the current and the contemporary struggles? Continuity of identity, continuity of belonging is not only about a physical place, but it's also about the struggles. We have not only struggled, we have also celebrated and been joyous. How do we draw those into the contemporary form of struggle so that we can learn from the past and innovate into the future? So some of the relationship building has to be around knowledge and practice production and innovation and a collective imagining, and evoking imagination has to be a critical part of this relationship building as well. How do we not become stale and stagnate in the old? How can we continue to innovate and to create new ways of struggle to address these ever-changing contexts that I've spoken about earlier? Thank you very much.
What a great place to land as we wrap up. And I'm watching to see if we have any questions. We don't yet. So I'm going to make the call and say, I'd like for us to wrap by talking about the future. What is it that we'd like to see for the future of cultural heritage? What does a potential framework look like? What's at top of mind for you right now as have heard this conversation, this commentary? Brandy, what's top of your mind?
So I think I agree with what all the folks have said so far, and I think it's so important for the cultural and the ethos, the mindset shift of the institutions being the experts on Indigenous peoples and our ancestors. And I think it's also recognizing that repatriation is more than just reunification, that it's so much more than that. And so the process is more than just the reunification. And so thinking about making sure that our stewardship processes shift, that our language shifts, that we are also recognizing the whole person and not just a deliverable or not just a state mandated law. And the importance of, I think, community care, I think is at the heart. And what does that look like from 5 years from now? Because the systems, they are inherently colonial, but that doesn't mean that they can't be decolonizing, and that takes steps. And I think that that's where it's shifting the culture and the structure of the culture. That's kind of where I sit, I think.
Thank you. George, are you still with us?
Yes, I'm very much with you, Cinnamon. I can't run away from this interesting discussion. And of course, I mean, it's been fantastic listening to all the panelists and the thoughts that they bring in here. I also agree with Brandy in this conclusion that the issue of restitution is much more than just returning, the ancestors in terms of the bodies or returning objects. I think it's a question of opening up to discuss some very painful past. It's a question of revisiting some of the agendas of the past that have not been dealt with. It's a question of decolonizing the mind, the body, and the spirit. It's also a question of decolonizing the narrative. I mean, some of the museums that are returning or are in the rush to return, when you go to them, the narrative is still the same of what they think about, what they had before. They have not changed that. So I think that this is an opportunity. I don't think that we should confine it to just picking up, filling the bags, and putting them back to where they came from. It is a question of opening up very tough discussions on what has happened in the past with a view to forgiving, not forgetting, with a view to correcting, with a view to making sure that everybody be at peace with one another and with everybody else, with a view to accepting that there's a lot of diversity in humanity, and that we need to accept those diversities. And that, as has been stated before by the Indigenous Communities Organization, that there is no one science, but there are many sciences. And these sciences must be accepted. Even the science of how we understand our heritage, our people, the way we understand our being has to be accepted. That there is no one central place. There is no center of the world, but many centers of the world. There's no far place. Every place is near, and we are one, but in diversity. And that we need to understand that diversity, respect that diversity. And when it comes to issues that touches on spirituality, that touches on human remains, that touches on things that actually influence our lives and our beings on a daily basis, that we should be able to understand it from the perspective and the point of view of that person who is living it, not the way that we deal with it in the laboratories and the collections. And I think when we come to that, then we will be actually talking the same language. For now, I think we are still discussing from very different perspectives. We have to understand that restitution is more than just return. Thank you.
Tariki.
I have 1,000 ideas and a thousand thoughts around this issue, because there are definitely opportunities, but I think where we actually find ourselves, as a civilization as a real strong inflection point to look at our practices and where we've been, and also kind of like try and find a new way forward that's actually beneficial. I want to swing back to George's previous comments that he made around the importance for museums to really take a long, hard look at themselves before they even start thinking about how do we actually go about this, and having a look at their role within communities and within societies. The first point that George also mentioned was that museums aren't the institutions at the top, at the top of the apex, right? The role and the function that Te Papa plays is one that actually facilitates. We don't take ownership of the ancestral remains. We take responsibility, but not ownership, and we help facilitate for their return home. And it's understanding that nature, having an understanding that's the nature of your relationship is very, very important to actually being able to commit towards doing this work. But as far as the global framework, I think there is definitely a space, but there's also a comment just further on back in that, like, policies on their own are useless, unless you actually do have a system and an ecosystem and an environment that actually ensures that this whole global framework can sustain itself. It's really important to actually do that. To do that groundwork and to bring in commitments of many people in many countries there. And Deidre also mentioned that it's an iterative process, and I think that's also something that also needs to be at the forefront of our minds, not just when we are designing the processes, but when we're actually delivering them and making sure that it's actually a living process, that it is a framework that actually addresses not just the needs of our time, but also the individual needs of the communities that we're trying to serve. But there's a sustainability issue here as well that also needs to be addressed, and that is around also, and I think Deidre's talk was fantastic, around establishing those relationships first that cross generations, because that ensures sustainability, but also developing the relationships that cross borders, institutions, and communities, because the common denominator among all of us, regardless if we're working for a repatriation program or a museum or a community center or a government, is that we are people and we have elders and we have history, and we all come from somebody. And so, like, isn't it consistent to believe that we all just want to make sure that we are nurtured and loved and cared for and acknowledged? And so that's something there. So can I just make one more suggestion? On the first panel, there was a discussion around the third day, which was a facilitated talk from the EMRIP conference in Vancouver last year. And it creates a really interesting opportunity where how we actually approach having those difficult conversations. And I think it's a great opportunity for Indigenous cultures and Indigenous communities to find a way to put into practice the thing that we actually do best. One of the things that we should do best, and it's to express our hospitality, to share food, and to prepare food together. And so I think, as a practice going forward for our global communities, for our Indigenous communities, to have those really gnarly conversations, invite the museums that you're having a difficult time negotiating with, invite them to share a meal and to prepare a meal, because like when you actually engage in something so simple, the expression of that, then all of the expectations, all of the baggage that people take into a negotiating room with them gets put aside. And that's when people can really start connecting as individuals and as communities. So, yeah, some of my ideas.
I love it. I can't wait to have a meal with everyone here someday. I will travel to have a meal with you. Wow, this has been an extraordinary conversation. I am so grateful for our participants in the commentary. It's been rich all around. I will close this out now with deep gratitude to all of you for joining me today. I cannot say thank you enough for being here and sharing this space and your thoughts and your work with all of us. It is meaningful and it's making a difference. So thank you. And I also have a quick list of people to thank with a very special thank you at the end. So hold on for that. In addition to my colleagues at the Illinois State Museum, there are numerous people to thank for making this series possible. The Residential School and Dialogue Center at the University of British Columbia, the Museum of Us, the Ohio History Connection, the Canada Research Chair on Civic Museology at the University of Montreal, the Maryland Institute College of the Arts, ICOM's International Committee on Collecting, known as COMCOL, and the incomparable Armando Perla, whose idea this was, and with his leadership, we were all able to come together. I could not have been part of this without him, and I am so grateful to Armando. So thank you. Everyone, have a great rest of your day. Good night, George, and have the best of days. Take care.